You, sir, should unmask.
Indeed?
Indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise, but you.
I wear no mask.
No mask? No mask!
Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Today I'll be making all of you lose your sanity. No, I'm joking obviously, but I finally finished reading a certain story that has always caught my interest, but I never got around to reading it. So that is when I decided to order myself a hard copy of it. That being The King in Yellow. I don't know if you guys can see this, but yes. The book was written by Robert William Chambers back in the 1895. Chambers is known for his famous book of stories, which is The King in Yellow. Yeah, that's what he's most famous for, and has had huge influence on H.P. Lovecraft's work. The fictional short stories inside the book were said to drive the reader insane. I first heard of this story a while back. I can't really put my finger on it, but I do remember seeing that Tale Foundry made a video about it. So as I was searching around the internet for like different stories and just different topics, the story was brought to my attention once again recently, and I decided to, I was like, okay, let's give the story a shot. So get ready, as I will be explaining some of the stories that drive people insane. Now, before I go into the story, I need to explain a couple of things first. At first, when I went into the story thinking it was a horror story, and to some extent it can be, but it's not scary compared to your like average horror story. The story's just weird. If I were to describe it in one word, weird. Before I read the story, I did do a little research on it and saw that it was like a series of short horror stories. So I went into the story expecting it to be scary, but halfway through the book, I was just getting so confused and lost that I decided to do some research on the stories. You see, The King in Yellow is divided into 10 short stories, and the first 4 stories happen to be the most important ones, as they're the only ones that mention the actual King in Yellow. And yeah, they are. Now, I did finish the other 6 stories because of my curiosity, and I just wanted to finish the book. But today, I will be only covering the first 4 stories, as the other 6 stories do not mention anything with the King in Yellow, nor do they have anything to do with horror. The best way I can describe the last 6 stories is just like romance/drama stories, because Chambers is known for writing romantic stories, and I felt that he just put them in there for... Honestly, I have no clue why they're in there. I feel like at the end of the stories, he just tried to cater toward his core audience, which is why maybe they're bundled together. It's hard to say, but these stories, like I mentioned previously, are not scary, but rather just weird. Now, the short stories in The King in Yellow are about a forbidden play that spreads like a plague, and it corrupts the reader's mind with despair and madness. It has pretty much become an order in the short stories. Like within the stories, nobody wants to read the play, and because they're all aware of its effects that it has on the reader. Now, us to the reader, we do not know what the play is, but Chambers does excerpt like little sections from the play that help us get an idea of the play. For example, in the beginning, it shows Casilda's song, which introduces 3 characters: Casilla, Camilla, and the stranger. It states to be from Act 1, Scene 2 of the play, and goes by the following, quote, "Along the shore, the cloud waves break. The twin suns sink behind the lake. The shadows lengthen in Carcosa. Strange is the night where black stars rise, and strange moons circle through the skies. But stranger still is lost, Carcosa. Songs that the high days shall sing, where flap the tatters of the king, must die unheard in dim Carcosa. Song of my soul, my voice is dead. Die thou unsung as tears unshed, shall dry and die in lost Carcosa." End quote. If you don't know what that means, do not worry, because nobody does. Now, I will try to explain these stories in a way that everyone can understand, because I feel like sometimes it can get quite confusing sometimes. So with that said, we can dive into the first story of the 4, which is The Repairer of Reputations. Before it even begins, it displays the text, quote, I'm going to butcher that so badly, so I'll just play a Google Translate.
Ne raillons pas les fous, leur folie dure plus longtemps que la nôtre. Voilà toute la différence.
But essentially this quoted message means, let's not make fun of fools, their madness lasts longer than ours. That's all the difference, end quote. The story takes place in New York City in the year 1920, and it's told from the point of view of a character named Hildred Castaigne. Castaigne explains how the US is set in this type of utopia, where the US managed to prevent Germany from ruling the world. Castaigne also explains how many of the US cities have been fully rebuilt with superior systems and architecture. We then learn in the winter of 1911 that they began to show signs to allow people to commit suicide. This would then later be confirmed by Castaigne starting in the time of the month of April 1920. The very first government lethal chamber would be open on Washington Square, because this is taking place in New York City. So they're basically allowing people to take their own lives if they wish in these like lethal chambers that are spread out across the city. We'll see more of this idea in a bit, but for now we get introduced to Dr. Archer, who we find out is the one that took care of Castaigne after an injury. Now Castaigne was said to have fallen from his horse 4 years prior right now, and because of this injury, Dr. Archer would take care of him and announce this injury affected his brain. So Dr. Archer would then place him in a private asylum to cure his insanity. So during this time recovering, Castaigne stated that he began to read a certain book going by the name The King in Yellow. Castaigne continues to explain that he has read the play. When he was reading the play, he laughed, he cried, and he kept shaking from the horror, but he knew he should no longer read it, so he casted it in a fireplace. However, the book would not let him go, so he manages to retrieve the book from the fireplace and continue to read it. He also goes on to explain how the book is this infectious disease and banned from different places in the world by saying, quote, "It is well known how the book spread like an infectious disease, from city to city, from continent to continent, bared out here, confiscated there, denounced by press and pulpit, censored even by the most advanced of literacy anarchists." End quote. So pretty much this book, The King in Yellow, is banned everywhere, and now no one should dare read it. Also remember that Castaigne had this injury 4 years ago, and that it pretty much changed his whole mindset. So what we know is that Castaigne was in an accident that affected his brain, but he claims he's healed now and doesn't need treatment from Dr. Archer anymore, and that he reads the book while recovering. So now, returning to present time, Castaigne is walking past a university to enter Washington Square, while a ceremony is going on where the government is officially announcing the lethal chambers to be open to the public, with basically the government saying that no man should suffer through physical and mental pain. The government believes that removing such weak-minded people would be beneficial to society pretty much. Castaigne leaves the ceremony and walks toward a shop called Halberg Armorer, where we get introduced to two other characters known as Halberg and the shop's owner, Halberg's daughter, Constant. It's also around this time that we learn that Castaigne has a cousin called Louise, who is in love with Halberg's daughter, Constant. After Castaigne enters the shop, Halberg and him spark up a casual conversation. A little later, Castaigne begins his leave, but before he can leave, Halberg mentions a comment going by the line of, quote, "Oh, are you going to see that lunatic again?" End quote. This is where we get introduced to Mr. Wildy. Now, to everyone else, Mr. Wildy is a crazy lunatic that is unstable, but in Castaigne's eyes, he sees him as a genius, saying things like, quote, "No, he is not vicious, nor is he the least demented. His mind is a wonder chamber, from which he can extract treasures that you and I would give years of our lives to acquire," end quote. So it is around this time that we see also that Castaigne despises words like crazy and lunatics, as he claims that he needs to suppress his emotions, as he gets angry when people use words like that on him or Mr. Wildy. Okay, so let's take a quick step back. We have Castaigne, the narrator, Dr. Archer, who is Castaigne's doctor. We also have Halberg and his daughter Constant, who run an armorer shop. And then we have Castaigne's cousin, Louise, who we find out is in love with Constant. And finally, we have Mr. Wildy, who lives in a different section in the shop, but he is the one that is identified as crazy. So pretty much he lives upstairs in the shop and everyone thinks he's crazy, except for Castaigne. So these are our characters for this story. So after Halberg and Castaigne are done arguing, Castaigne leaves to go visit Mr. Wildy upstairs. Mr. Wildy's appearance is described as hideous by many others. It's said that he has a dozen scratch marks on his face and silver wires that support his artificial ears because he doesn't have real ears, I guess, and that his entire face is yellow. makes you question where he got that color from. Castaigne, upon visiting him, says the following, quote, "Many called him insane, but I knew him to be as sane as I was." End quote. And the reason I bring this up is because it's pretty funny later on, as you'll see why this might be true. But after a bit of chatting from the two of them, we learn that Mr. Wildy has also read the book The King in Yellow. What a surprise. Mr. Wildy then hands Castaigne a manuscript called The Imperial Dynasty of America, to which he makes Castaigne study and read. After Castaigne studies the manuscript a bit, he notices that the manuscript brings up Castaigne's name and his cousin Louis's name in the manuscript, with the manuscript stating that Castaigne will be the first successor. This then brings Mr. Wildy to mention Castaigne about how they are in control of the states and countries, and that all Imperials must serve the King in Yellow, with the yellow sign, to which we'll hear about that more in the future. So I just want to quickly mention that you can see how Castaigne and Mr. Wildy are truly convinced that the King in Yellow's fantasy world is real, and how they believe that the King in Yellow is order, and this also gives us, the reader, a reason to believe that they're insane. Castaigne and Mr. Wildy then get interrupted by a regiment with military music. By the way, regiment is a bunch of those marching soldiers that you see sometimes on the streets. Castaigne also notices that his cousin Louis is among the regiment, so this is where we find out that his cousin Louis is an officer. Soon after, Castaigne leaves Mr. Wildy's place to go think and wander around a nearby park before dinner. However, Castaigne is greeted by a group of officers passing by him, and among those officers, guess who it is? It's his cousin Louis. Castaigne and Louis exchange in conversation, and Castaigne mentions that he just returned from Mr. Wildy's place and prompts Louis to say this, quote, "I don't mean to run down a man you like, but for the life of me, I don't see what the deuce you find in common with Mr. Wildy. He's not well bred, to put it generously. He's hideously deformed. His head is the head of a criminally insane person. You know yourself he's been in an asylum." End quote. Castaigne gets angry with these comments, and the two of them begin to argue. And so we also see that Castaigne doesn't like it when people talk bad about Mr. Wildy either, as he gets really defensive about him. It's also around this time that Louis offers to take a stroll, accompanied by Halbert and Constant as well. So pretty much the four of them are taking this nice little walk around the city, just chatting and just admiring the New York City pretty much. So it's Constant, Halbert, Louis, and Castaigne just strolling, and it's during this time that Halbert tells Castaigne that he wants to thank Mr. Wildy, and the reason he wants to thank him is because Halbert claims that Mr. Wildy let Halbert know about a certain armor suit that would sell for big money, with Halbert stating, quote, "It is valued at 500, but the owner of the Princess and Blazod will give $2,000 to the person who completes his suit. That reward also belongs to Mr. Wildy," end quote. So if Halbert were to finish completing this suit and manage to sell it, then some of the rewards would belong to Mr. Wildy. But as you can guess, Mr. Castaigne he quickly cuts him off by saying, quote, "He doesn't want it. He refuses it." I answered angrily, "What do you know about Mr. Wildy? He doesn't need the money. He is rich, or will be, richer than any living man except myself. What we will care for money then? What will we care, he and I, when you will see." End quote. So like mentioned previously, this shows how defensive he is about Mr. Wildy and how angry he gets when anyone mentions him. Halbert and Castaigne continue to argue, and it's also around this time that we notice that Castaigne hates when people begin to grow worried about his mental health or just overall well-being. So after this, we get fast forwarded to May, where we see Castaigne in his home trying on different things, I would say. So one early morning in May, Castaigne was home and stood before a steel safe in his bedroom trying on a golden jeweled crown. While he tries on his diamond gold crown, he recalls back to the phrases of the King in Yellow, claiming to hear Camilla's scream and words echoing through the streets of Carcosa. So Castaigne is pretty much imagining himself in his bedroom, like daydreaming kind of, until he gets interrupted by his cousin Louis, who decides to pay him a visit. Louis, however, comments on this behavior of what he's doing in his bedroom by saying, quote, "What is all this?" he inquired in a gentle voice. "Are you ill?" "No," I replied, "but I doubt if he heard me." Come, old fellow," he cried. "Take off that brass crown and toddle it into the study. Are you going to a masquerade? What's all this theatrical tinsel anyway?" End quote. So this is where we start to see little hints that Castaigne is actually insane, as Louis refers to his diamond gold crown as a crown made of brass and paste, Also, that so-called steel safe where Castaigne keeps the crown in, yeah, Luis calls it a biscuit box. It's little hints like this that tell us that Castaigne sees the world completely differently from how others view it. After the two argue a bit, Luis finally explains to Castaigne how he's going to get married to Constant and that he wants Castaigne to be his best man. Castaigne's shocked, obviously he'd be shocked that his cousin's getting married, later gets his composure together and makes a request to Luis and says that he wants to talk to Luis at a park during midnight. Surely nothing can go wrong. After this strange request that Castaigne makes, Luis leaves while Castaigne makes his way to Mr. Wildy's place. Arriving at Mr. Wildy's place, Castaigne goes on to pull down the manuscript of the Imperial Dynasty of America and studies it once more. Mr. Wildy then introduces another character going by the name Vance to Castaigne. Now, we don't know much about Vance other than he's been held hostage by Mr. Wildy pretty much. But after this little introduction, Mr. Wildy then reads the manuscript to Castaigne and Vance, explaining their positions in a plan. So pretty much Castaigne goes over to Mr. Wildy's place, pulls down the manuscript of the Imperial Dynasty and starts to study it, and then he gets introduced to Vance. So again, let's assess what's happening. Mr. Wildy and Castaigne read the manuscripts once again and believe that in order for Castaigne to become king, he must not allow his cousin Luis to be married. Castaigne continues to express how he himself is worthy of the crown in yellow and how his cousin must be exiled or die. So Castaigne is pretty much convinced that his cousin Luis is standing before him in succession for the crown, so therefore for this reason Luis must be dealt with Castaigne claiming, quote, "The time had come. People should know of the king of Hastur, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa." End quote. Yeah, so it's pretty cut and dry now that they're all crazy. Now, if you're wondering about Vance, well, we'll get to him in a little bit. Castaigne later that night meets up with his cousin Luis in the middle of the night in a park. Upon meeting Luis, Castaigne asks what he wanted to talk about. Castaigne then proceeds to pull out manuscripts and tells Luis to read them without asking any questions. Now, of course, Luis is perplexed at this request, but promises to read the manuscripts without asking any questions. Luis asks for the paper from Castaigne, reads the paper with a puzzled look, and returns it back to Castaigne. Castaigne then pulls out another piece of paper that has the yellow sign on it, and it shows it to Luis and tells him if he knows anything about the symbol. However, Luis tells him that he doesn't know anything about it. This makes Castaigne very angry, and he explains to Luis that it's the yellow sign, and later tells Luis that he must renounce the crown to him. Now, you can notice that Luis has no idea what is going on, and he's kind of like, what the hell are you talking about? Luis then grows bored about all of this and simply offers to walk Castaigne back home as it's getting late. But this causes Castaigne to grow very angry, and Castaigne cries out, quote, "No," I shouted, "you must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. You shall renounce the crown, and reward I grant you exile. But if you refuse, you shall die." End quote. Castaigne would then draw a huge long knife and told Luis, laughing, that they would find Dr. Archer in his cellar with his throat cut open. Castaigne also tells Luis that Vance had taken care of Halberg and Constant back in the shop, so nothing can stand in his way now. Seconds later, Vance comes out of nowhere and runs full speed into a lethal chamber with a cry indicating to Castaigne that he has assassinated Halberg and Constant. This then prompts Castaigne to bolt out of the park towards Mr. Wildy's place, with Luis chasing him behind him, yelling at him to stop or he'll shoot. However, Luis does not pursue Castaigne any further as Castaigne proceeds to open Mr. Wildy's door and enter crying, quote, "It is done, it is done. Let the nations rise and look upon their king. At last I was king, king in my right in Hastur, king because I knew the mystery of the high days and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake of Hali. I was king." End quote. But Castaigne would find Mr. Wildy dead with his throat cut open. With this scene, Castaigne would lose all hope, seeing that his master has been killed and there is no future. Minutes later, Castaigne would be seized from behind by police officers, but Castaigne would then go into a state of shock as he sees Halberg, Luis, and Constant still alive, watching him getting taken away pretty much. But before getting taken away, Castaigne would yell the following, quote, "Ah, I see it now," I shrieked. "You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the king in yellow." End quote. At the bottom of the story, it ends with the editor's note that states Castaigne died yesterday in the asylum for the criminally insane. And that's the first story of The King in Yellow. I did forget to mention this at the beginning, but this is the longest story out of the 4. I kind of want to save my thoughts for the very end of the 4 stories, but I'll briefly give some of my thoughts on this one real fast. This story is told from an unreliable narrator, to which we can see is delusional and crazy, but at the same time, none of what he's saying can be disproven in the story either. None of it is disproven. We don't know if the government actually built these lethal chambers, or we don't know if the world is in this type of utopia that Castaigne claims it to be. And as for the killings, we don't know if Vance actually went through with the killings, obviously not, because Constance and Halbrook are still alive at the end of the story, but at the same time, we don't know if he even existed in the first place. Also, we don't know if Castaigne even killed Dr. Archer either, it's never proven or disproven. He could have just been, what the fuck? Okay, so I don't know what happened there, my lights just went out, but like I was saying, Mr. Castaigne could have just easily been telling the story through his fantasy world made up in his head. And I guess that's the whole point of the story, is that it's told from an unreliable narrator. We don't know what is true and what's not true. But we do know one thing that is true, which is the book in The King of Yellow does affect the reader's mind and corrupts it pretty much. Or at least the text itself. The text itself at least has some supernatural effect in it. And that leads us into the second story of The King in Yellow. That being The Mask. Doing some research for the story, I found out that this story is the most favorite out of the 4 stories that is in the book. Now personally, I did enjoy the story, but wouldn't call it my favorite out of the 4, but the story starts off with the act that was present in the very start of the video. If you forgot how it goes, quote, Camilla, you sir shall unmask. Stranger, indeed. Casilda, indeed, it's time. We all have laid aside disguise but you. Stranger, I wear no mask. Camilla, terrified aside to Casilla. No mask? No mask! The story takes place in Paris with the narrator called Alec watching someone dunk their hand into some chemical solution, retrieving a flower out of it, which is now turned into marble. We then get introduced to the next character of the story, which is Boris, who explains that anything that the chemical touches, it will turn into marble, and any living thing dunked into the chemical will produce a sunlight beam. So pretty much Boris is the one to discover or invent this new chemical solution that turns anything into marble. It doesn't explain how he created this chemical solution, it just says that he's the one to discover it. Soon we then get introduced to Genevieve, who asks Alec to stay for lunch, and of course Alec accepts. So let me properly explain the setting right now. So pretty much they're all at Boris's home. Boris is a rich friend that owns a huge mansion and pretty much is a sculptor who discovered the marble chemical solution. Genevieve is a girl who is the lover of Boris and is friends with Alec as well. And finally we have Alec, who is the narrator of the story and is friends with Boris and Genevieve. So returning back to the story, Boris and Genevieve ask Alec to stay for lunch as they're working on the sculpture, and Alec accepts to stay for lunch. But it's around this time that we learn that Alec has been in love with Genevieve for quite some time. I believe it's 2 years or something like that. However, Genevieve has told Alec that her love is for Boris, and she likes Alec, but she loves Boris even more. So we're in this situation where it's kind of this love triangle with these 3 friends. So basically, Alec and Boris like Genevieve, but Genevieve likes Boris, and for 2 years, Alec has been letting them just pretty much be without him interfering, kind of letting them be together. Even though he likes Genevieve too, he has to take the bullet pretty much. So that's the situation we're dealing with in this story. So back to the story, we see that Genevieve asks Alec to stay for lunch. He starts to daydream about her, expressing how much he likes her, saying, quote, I preferred her so rather than in that Madonna, like tranquility which stirred the depths of my heart. I was dreaming of Genevieve when he spoke again. End quote. Boris then interrupts Alec's daydreaming by explaining more about the chemical solution to Alec and says that he can't release it to anyone as many would go mad over his discovery. Alec and Boris then leave the room to go eat lunch, and after this the book actually says how old they all are. So we learn that Genevieve is 18, Boris is 23, and Alec the narrator is 20 years old. Soon later, Boris explains to Alec that he had made a pool full of this chemical solution that turns things into marble, to which he jokes and teases Alec with. They then continue to work on their own projects, and Alec is said to be working on a painting for Genevieve's boudoir. A boudoir is basically a woman's bedroom, if you didn't know that, because I didn't. After they're done working for the day, they all head down to the smoke room, where they go to smoke tobacco and relax. But is it explained by Alec that this particular day felt strange and the twilight was very soothing? Don't know what that means, but basically they're smoking. I'm pretty sure it's getting to them, because seconds later Alec is knocked out on the couch with some cushion. However, Alec would then be soon awakened by what he claims to be the saddest music ever, and would wake up in a dark room. Alec awakens and starts to wander as he cries out for Genevieve. Soon he finds her as she drops to the sound of his voice. Alec would then go to a sister to go help her up, but she would tell Alec to call Boris, but Boris is not seen to be anywhere around. Later on, it is said that Boris and Alec actually go walking around the studio restlessly, as it is later found out that Genevieve had sprained her ankle wandering around in the dark and tripping over a wolf head. Okay, so a lot has happened basically, but let me explain it real fast. Basically, after work, the three of them went to go to the smoke room to relax for the day, pretty much just chill down and relax. However, Alec falls asleep on the couch. As the other two, we don't know anything that happens to them. The story never says anything pretty much, but we find out that Alec awakens in a dark room crying out for Genevieve. He finds her, but she is suffering from a sprained ankle after tripping over in the dark, but would soon get ill afterwards. So Genevieve sprains her ankle and gets ill. Boris is not home at the moment, as Genevieve states that he went somewhere else pretty much. So now later at noon, Boris returns while Alec and him wait to see if Genevieve is alright, because she's getting treated by a doctor. That part can be confusing sometimes, so I tried my best to explain. As Boris and Alec wait to hear from Genevieve, Alec stumbles upon a certain book while waiting called The King in Yellow, to which he reads it for a moment and nervously puts it away. We are then introduced to another character in the story going by the name Jack. Jack is another friend of the three. Moments later, they hear a bell ring from above and a cry from the room Genevieve was resting in, and so Boris would swiftly bolt his way through, followed by Jack and Alec. Once they were all three in the room, they approach Genevieve at her bedside, as it is said by Alec, quote, "At my first touch she sighed and sank back, closing her eyes. Then, as we still bent above her, she opened them again, looked straight into Boris's face, poor fevered crazed girl, and told her secrets," end quote. It is at this exact moment that Alec comes to realize that the bond that held all three of them together was finally broken, and that a completely new bond was forged. Alex states, quote, "Incapable of movement, incapable of speech, I listened to her feverish words in an agony of shame and sorrow. I could not silence her. I could not look at Boris. Then I felt an arm upon my shoulder, and Boris turned a bloodless face to mine," end quote. With Boris saying, quote, "It is not your fault, Alec. Don't grieve. So if she loves you," end quote. Alec and Jake quickly leave the room, leaving Boris and Genevieve alone in that room. Alec would then leave to his apartment and suddenly grow very ill as well, with the last thing Alec remembering before going ill is the King in Yellow and the pallid mask. After this, the story pretty much takes a shift here, as Alec explains how he's always been ill and that he's been wearing a mask of deception over the course of these 2 years, since that morning that Genevieve told Alec that she loved him but loved Boris even more. Alec claimed, quote, "The mask of self-deception was no longer a mask for me, it was a part of me. Night lifted it, laying bare and stifled truth below, but there was no one to see except myself, and when the day broke, the mask fell back again of its own accord," end quote. So you can see that while this time Alec is ill and recovering, he's having some type of self-reflection and realizing that the mask of deception that he's been playing with for the past 2 years is no longer a mask, but instead has become like a part of him, like kind of. At last, one morning, Alec would awaken from his illness and find Jack reading beside him, saying, quote, "You must wait, Alec. You are too weak to see even Boris," end quote. After a week of Alec recovering and waiting, he finally tells Jack, quote, "Jack, I want to see Boris at once and take my dearest greeting to Genevieve," end quote. However, something unexpected happens. Jack has to make Alec understand that they both are dead, to which Jack hands Alec a letter and the keys to Boris's house. Alec obviously grows into a rage and demands to know what happened that day when he grew ill. Jack recalls to him that The day that Alec grew ill, Jack would take him to the doctor's care. Jack would then return to Boris's house and find Boris working on a sculpture silently while Genevieve is recovering in the other room. As Jack silently observes Boris's work, they would both hear a door open and shut quickly and rush into the next room. Boris would quickly make his way to the next room and find Genevieve at the bottom of the pool that contained Boris's chemical solution, because remember, he made a pool of this chemical solution that made stuff into marble. Boris, realizing the severity of the situation, then proceeds to shoot himself through the heart. Doesn't say anything about a specific weapon, but it just says that it kills him pretty much. He shoots himself through the heart. With Jack shocked with the events happening around him, he does the best thing and calls a doctor for the both of them. Okay, I know a lot happened, but let me explain again, because what the hell, right? So as Alec and Jack left Boris's house that day, Alec came down with an illness and spent a while recovering. During that time, Jack would return to Boris's house and find Boris working alone on his sculpture, when suddenly they would both hear a sound in the other room, to which they would both find out that Genevieve jumped into the pool of pretty much Boris's chemical solution. Reason for this is probably because she admitted that she loved Alec more than Boris and felt guilty about it. Now, Boris on the other hand, he just witnessed the love of his life just die in front of his eyes, so he immediately takes his own life. So that's pretty much what happened during Alex's recovery. Jack then tells Alec to read the letter that was handed to him by Boris, and within the letter it states that if anything were to happen to Boris, then Alec would be the new house owner. Jack continues to explain to Alec about the situation and tells Alec that Genevieve still lies in the marble room as a statue in the house. So once Alec is fully recovered, Alec decides to visit Boris's house, and upon exploring the house, he could not bring himself to enter the marble room that Genevieve is a statue in. During this time, Alec cannot bring himself to the reality of this situation going at hand, so he decides to leave Paris and travel the world for 2 years. During this time passes, and soon Alec would meet up with Jack once again after these 2 years of going their separate ways. They exchange in conversation, and they both explain to each other that seeing each other after all this mess was no good for them. So Alec returns to Paris once more, and finally builds up the courage to visit Boris's house after 2 years. There he spends the afternoon in the smoking room, reminding himself of the good old times of the three of them. However, a maid visits Alec in the moment and explains to him how some of the marble statues are disappearing in the house. Now, Alec thought nothing of it until he finds a flower that originally was a marble, now fresh and fragile. With this discovery, he quickly springs through the hallways to the marble room and flings the door open for him to find Genevieve no longer a statue, opening her eyes in 2 years. And that is where the second story ends. So if you didn't understand the ending, in short, basically the chemical solution that Boris made that turned everything into marble, it doesn't last forever and eventually will go away after some time. Now this is great for Alec because now he can spend the rest of his lifetime with Genevieve, but you gotta feel a little bad for Boris, you know? He took his own life because he thought it was all over. Basically, my dude Alec played the waiting game for a while. So I guess you can say the story ends with a happy ending, and I guess I can see why many find this one to be their favorite out of the 4, since it's kind of like this romantic love tale. But now let us move on to the third story, that being The Court in the Dragon. This one is interesting, and you'll see why in a bit. The story starts off with the following poem, quote, "O thou who burn in heart for those who burn in hell, whose fires thyself shall feed in turn, how long will you be crying mercy on them, God? Why, who art thou to teach and he to learn?" End quote. It starts off with the narrator explaining some details and experience in the church of the St. Barney Vespers. Also throughout this story, the narrator's name is not mentioned, so I will be referring to the narrator as them/they/narrator. After this, the organist, a person that plays music in the church, walks in and prepares to start playing some of the music. And as the organ begins to play the first chord, the narrator feels like a sudden shift, almost like a sinister change within the church. So the narrator continues to complain about this terrible, sinister music playing, as they described it as harsh and dissonant, and pretty much because most of the times in churches the music is nice and holy, but not in this story. Pretty much the music is just sinister and just super harsh and just evil. Soon the narrator's annoyance changes into anger, but finally at last the preacher arrives and makes the sign of the cross and commands everyone to silence down. It is around this time that we learn that the narrator has been reading The King in Yellow. So now the preacher then goes into a speech describing the human soul and typical church speeches and just phrases in general. Now, as the preacher is giving the speech, a man passes by the narrator. The narrator thinks nothing of it until they notice that this man is the man delivering the awful music in the church. So the narrator glances at the man, and the man gives back a look of what the narrator describes as hate, intense, and deadly, with them saying, quote, "I have never seen anything like it. Would to God I might never see it again." End quote. The man would then disappear again, and the narrator would then think to himself, who would ever give such a hatred look to someone, especially him, as he was nothing but a stranger, stating, quote, "Why should he hate me so? Me, whom he had never seen before?" End quote. The narrator then continues to go outside the church for like a breath of fresh air to clear the hatred, like the hateful mood they're in, only for them to see the familiar figure of the stranger pass by once more. They then begin to assume that the stranger is nothing but a Sunday lounger just like he is, just like everyone else. But the narrator would once again come face to face with the man as the stranger walks by again with a slender frame. The narrator then describes the man as, quote, "He showed no signs of haste, nor of fatigue, nor of any human feeling. His whole being expressed one thing, the will and the power to work me evil." End quote. So basically the narrator is getting this bad feeling from this man that appears out of nowhere once they have left the church, and you'll soon see what it is at the end. But hours pass by with no sight of the man once again, as the narrator eventually finds himself in a small cafe wandering around, but eventually they grow tired looking for the man and call a cab to make their way back home, where they claim they live in the court of the dragon. Once the narrator arrives back home and enters the court to walk to their apartment, which is like on the top floor, they notice something over their right shoulder. And that's right, you guessed it, it would be the stranger following them. They both would make eye contact once more, and the narrator retreats down the court to escape by the entrance of the court. But they couldn't, claiming, quote, "His eyes told me that I should never escape. I felt this by the blackness which surrounded me. And at the same instant, I read it in his face. How his face gleamed in the darkness, drawing swiftly nearer." End quote. The narrator then awakens to the sound of scraping chairs and music as they awaken in the church once again, now believing that it was nothing but a dream and that they must have just slept through the sermon in church. But soon the strange man would walk in once again, almost like this already happened, but instead a dazzling light fills the church and people begin to fade and vanish. The narrator then says, quote, "And now far away over leagues of tossing cloud waves, I saw the moon dripping with spray, and beyond, the towers of Carcosa rose behind the moon." End quote. Following this with, quote, "And now I heard his voice rising and swelling, thundering through the flaring light. And as I felt the radiance increasing poured over me in waves of flame. Then I sank into the depths, and I heard the King in Yellow whispering to my soul, 'It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God.'" And that is where the third story ends, with the sickest line of the book has to offer, and definitely the shortest of the four. But I would like to mention that this is the only story that describes the King in Yellow as a being / entity, like the other stories simply mention the book, but this one actually mentions like the actual King in Yellow. But basically, if you didn't get what happened at the end, basically the narrator at the end was teleported or shifted to another world known as Carcosa, where the King in Yellow lives, with the narrator explaining cloud waves and towers of Carcosa that rose behind the moon, and the moon dripping. Speaking of the King in Yellow, finally this leads us into our final story, which is the Yellow Sign. The story kicks off with yet another poem. Quote, "Let the red dawn surmise what we shall do when this blue starlight dies and all is through." End quote. We then get introduced to the narrator, who goes by the name Scott. Scott, like many others in the story, is a great artist that works on projects, but the story takes place in New York City this time. So it starts off as one day Scott notices an overweight, pale young man who is the watchman of the church next door to his building, apartment building pretty much. Scott kind of tells himself that this man reminds him of, quote, the impression of a plump white grave worm who was so intense and nauseating that I must have shown it my expression, end quote. Scott shrugs the look off and resumes to work on his painting, and this is where we get introduced to our second character of the story, which is Tessie. Tessie is a model that works for Scott, so like she stands still while he paints her type of stuff. However, while Scott is working, he's painted over her with like skin that has become sallow and like unhealthy, almost yellow like. He notices the mistake on the canvas and proceeds to try to correct the color mistake, as it has messed up his entire canvas. But his attempts are futile, and then Tessie mentions how everything started to go wrong on the painting once Scott witnessed the horrid man's face in the churchyard. They both then stop doing their work to go lean out the windows to see the young man's face again, and they both express to each other how his face is fat and soft. So basically, you have Scott who saw this man's face and thought to himself, what a horrible face to see. He then resumes to his work, however he messes up his art, and Tessie states that everything started to go wrong ever since he saw that man. After Scott and Tessie are done looking out the window, Tessie recounts to Scott about a nightmare she had. Tessie claims that she was watching a hearse from her window out at night, and that Scott was in a coffin the hearse contained, but he wasn't dead, and that the hearse driver was none other than the church watchman. By the way, this is a nightmare that Tessie had. She's just telling it to Scott. By the way, if you don't know what a hearse is, it's basically this car that carries a coffin in the back. I'll throw it up on screen so you guys get a better idea. After Tessie tells Scott this nightmare, Scott just thought of it as nonsense and dismissed Tessie for the day, believing that she has been posing for too long and that from all the hard work she's been doing, she must have just lost her nerves. Scott then recommends Tessie that maybe she should go visit the countryside for a week or two, kind of like a vacation to calm her nerves down. However, Tessie says something strange and says, quote, what about the man in the churchyard, end quote. Scott responds with, quote, oh, he's an ordinary, unhealthy, everyday creature, end quote. So Scott doesn't really think anything of this man, and he thinks it's just overworking problems kind of, but Tessie on the other hand thinks something more is happening than usual. The next day we then get introduced to a short side character, Thomas, who is the building's bellboy. A bellboy is basically those people you see as who greet guests and customers by the check-in desk in a hotel or resort. Now Thomas goes to speak with Scott and they spark up a normal conversation as usual. They're pretty much just chatting until Thomas says that he and his friends were passing by the churchyard one night, and he's telling this to Scott, by the way. Thomas explains to Scott that he and his friends one night noticed the church's watchman staring at them, so they approached him saying in a New York accent, quote, what are you looking at, you fat slug? Beg pardon, sir, but that's how I said, sir. Then I continue to tell him, you want to get decked or should I jerk you off? Okay, no, he didn't actually say that last line. But Thomas mentions to Scott that he punched the watchman and that when he punched him, he describes the watchman's flesh as cold and mushy. Furthermore, as the watchman grabbed Thomas's wrist after the punch, after pretty much the collision, the watchman's middle finger came off on Thomas's hand, and this quickly made Thomas and his friends run away from the encounter. A little after this, Scott returns back to his studio to go back to work and is then greeted by Tessie. They both return to work as usual, painting on their just doing their usual painting stuff. But it's around this time that Scott thinks himself how attached he is to Tessie, as she's always been one of his favorite models, and that he's seen her grow up into a formal woman. Scott simply wishes that Tessie would stay well and steer clear from any complications. So you can see that Scott kind of sees Tessie as a daughter or a little sister figure, as he simply just wants the best for Tessie. Scott then proceeds to tell Tessie about a certain nightmare that he has had ever since she told hers, to which Scott was in a glass coffin in the back of a hearse and that Tessie was watching from her window. However, this nightmare mentioned to Tessie would not sit right with her, as seconds later she would start to feel unnerved and start to get upset. Scott comforts her and tells her that the story was not meant to upset her, but rather he just wanted to share his side of the nightmare. Once Tessie breaks down crying, she then expresses her feelings towards Scott and tells him that she is worried about what might happen to him. Tessie and Scott then share a kiss. Okay, so basically Scott and Tessie are working and Scott tells Tessie about a side of her of his nightmare. She then breaks down, fearing something bad might happen to Scott, and starts to express her feelings towards Scott, and then they both share a kiss. So that's just what happened right now. Soon later, Scott that evening takes a stroll in a local park and begins to question himself about all the actions that have happened, pretty much occurred earlier. Later that night, as Scott is returning back to his apartment, he passes by the churchyard, and only good things happen at the churchyard, right? Scott walks by the church's watchman, and as he walks past him, the watchman asks him, quote, "Have you found the yellow sign?" End quote. Scott was puzzled but thought nothing of it, as he couldn't really make out the words the churchman was saying to him. The next day, Scott heads down to the studio to meet up with Tessie, and they begin their usual just painting work, just work in general. However, before they begin their work, Tessie gives Scott a black onyx pin with a mysterious gold symbol that she found in the park after visiting the aquarium. Almost like it's a yellow sign or something, you know? The following day was usual, but as they worked on painting, Scott was looking for something amongst his bookshelf, but was perplexed to notice a book in yellow standing in the corner. Scott gets upset, stumbling upon this book as he heard about his acquaintance Castain after he read the book. Quick little mention of the first story there. As he's looking through the bookshelf, Tessie questions what the book is and climbs to retrieve the book. Scott quickly asks her not to touch it. Tessie's curiosity got the best of her though, as she took the book, laughing, and danced away with it. Scott follows her until he finally finds her crouching white and silent by a window in the storeroom. As Scott approaches her, he notices that she had opened the book and completely read it. Tessie was now in a complete daze, and Scott couldn't determine whether she was awake or asleep. But he takes the book from her and sits down himself to read the book from beginning to the end. Now this part always makes me question his actions, because he heard what happened to Castain, so he knows the effects of the book, so why the hell would he read it? However, once Scott is finishing reading the book, he would soon awaken from a daze, and so does Tessie, but then Scott realizes that he and her, during the days, they've been talking about the King in Yellow all this time. Night would soon fall, and the hours dragged on, but still they would both murmur to each other about the King in Yellow and the pallid mask, and midnight and just pretty much phrases from the King in Yellow. Tessie and Scott would then continue to talk about the King in Yellow until the building grew very silent, when suddenly they would both hear a loud sound and soon realize that the watchman had infiltrated their home and gained access to it. Scott then would explain the following, quote, "Now he is at the door, and then the bolts rotted at his touch. Now he has entered. With eyes starting from my head, I peered into the darkness, but when he came into the room, I did not see him." End quote. The watchman proceeds to tear the yellow sign from Scott's clothes and strikes him in the face. Seconds later, Scott states the following, quote, "Then as I fell, I heard Tessie's soft cry, and her spirit fled to God. And even while falling, I longed to follow her, for I knew that the King in Yellow had opened his tattered mantle, and there was only Christ to cry to now." So pretty much the watchman broke into their apartment and slaughtered both of them. The next day, a doctor says that Scott is quickly dying and does not have much time left, as well as states as for the watchman, the doctor claims, quote, "I have no theory, no explanation. That man must have been dead for months." Scott's final words before dying are, quote, "I think I am dying. I wish the priest would." And that is where the fourth story ends and the final story ends. As expected, this one did not have a happy ending, and both of the characters die in the King in Yellow, but again, the story displays supernatural elements in it. In this story, I don't know if the Watchman was actually the King in Yellow or was just one of his minions doing this, but nonetheless, it all goes back to the book and to the book The King in Yellow, that the book pretty much just brings despair and madness to the reader. So those are the four stories of the book. Like I mentioned previously, the second part of the book doesn't have anything to do with The King in Yellow, but instead there are just romantic love stories that I imagine Chambers was trying to fit in the book for his core audience, because remember, Chambers is known for writing romantic stories. Now, I'm gonna say this right now, my favorite one out of the four is the first story, the repairer of reputations. It's a story that many are familiar with and the one that drags a lot of people into the book. Of course, the mask comes in second, but the first story, personally for me, is just a lot more interesting. The King in Yellow is weird. It's definitely one of those books that makes a lot more sense on your second read through, as you now know what is going on. But I can imagine if you would read this completely blind for the first time with no idea of the plot, you would definitely have to go back a couple times to understand it. After I finished the story, I wanted to see what many other people thought of, so I kind of looked up like what people kind of thought of the book, and most of them had the same type of idea. The book is weird, pretty much just the foundation that inspired Lovecraft's work. That pretty much wraps up the video. Thank you all for watching. I hope it was as entertaining for you guys to stick around to the end. But seriously, thank you all for everything. That's pretty much the video. So I will see you all in the next one. Bye.